as we get started with Revelation 13. What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Here we go.
No, that's good. Just so I can see everything.
Okay, Mandy's over here, so she wants to be able to see everybody's face. But I wanted us to tackle Revelation 13, hopefully in a night together. But so I want us to jump into it kind of straight away, but and understand what's going on here. But I wanted to pass along something that was in one of the commentaries I've been using from Craig Keener, because as we get into these two beasts, the dragon and then the beast that comes up out of the water, and we traditionally interpret, and I think we are right to, from reading Revelation, that beast is the Antichrist who comes up. When the topic of the Antichrist comes up, almost always the conversation can skew into making guesses about, well, who is that person in our day now, and what's going on, and who fulfills this and fulfills that, and who fits enough of that description that we can believe it about them. And I really appreciated a point that Keener makes, and he said, and I'm quoting, speculating on what some Antichrist figure may do, especially in light of this text, talking about the mark of the beast specifically, he said, is not the same thing as interpreting the meaning of this text. And I thought that was a really important distinction to keep our eyes both on the original and intent and on the practical application for us, and not falling into the temptation of trying to decode Revelation. Because I think when we do that, it tends to be an effort to put ourselves in a place of power over Scripture. We can decode it, we can understand it, we can find its secrets and see what it truly says, as opposed to the far more humble view of trying to say, what is God trying to tell us in this, as opposed to what can we figure out within this. And so I think if we keep our eye on the original intent and on the practical, it actually lets us make this more engaging and applicable for our lives, as opposed to treating it like a puzzle that we can solve. And so I just wanted to make that point, that I think it's an important distinction to make here. And with that, I wanted to read the first 10 verses of Revelation, and then we'll talk about those, and then hopefully we'll be able to have time to get to the final 8 verses as well. So it begins like this in Revelation 13, after we saw from a couple weeks ago, if you remember, the woman who was born, and the woman and the child that was born from her, that was Jesus, and she ran to the desert, and the dragon chased her, and there was all this stuff going on. 13 begins and says, the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on its horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was filled with wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? Who can wage war against it? The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise its authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And it was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the Lamb's book of life, the Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity they will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword they will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Now, that is a pretty troubling image and a lot of stuff going on. And this beast from the sea is often understood, like I said, to be the Antichrist. And we're going to unpack that a little bit. But this description that happens at the beginning of 13 is, before we start trying to interpret, well, what does it mean to have to look like a leopard with the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion, and try to ascribe a spiritual significance to each one of these aspects? I think it helps us to recognize what John was almost certainly referencing. And I've got a slide here that I want to bring up because I think it's helpful. Here we go. I want to share this with you guys so you can see it. That we have this going on here. I have this one for you since it'll be easier to look at that. This description and comparison between Revelation 13 and Daniel 7, because John is almost certainly thinking of the language and the stuff that was going on in Daniel 7 as he talks about what he sees and what he knows here. And so you can see I just pulled a few of the references from one to the other so we can see the parallelism between these, because Daniel receives this vision as well right after coming out of the lion's den. I mean, he has this picture, and it's these four beasts who again come out of the sea. One of them has 10 horns, and so we see that being played, and that they speak boastfully, which kind of plays upon this idea that each one of them was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies as well. And then we have this leopard, bear, lion trio that comes up in both of these. One in the four beasts that come up, and this other in Revelation that seems to combine all these beasts into one hideous creature. And even the time that this beast has authority is the same. It's that same language that we talked about in the last chapter that was kind of confusing, that time, times, and half a time that Daniel uses to say 3.5 years, to have one time, which is 1 year, times being 2 years. So now we're at 3, and then a half a time to come up with 3.5 years, which again kind of mirrors that 42 months. And this idea that both are given power or authority over the saints, over the church, over everyone as they exist. So we have this really, I think, kind of an interesting back and forth. And this vision from Daniel is explained later in Daniel 7 to represent the nations that are going to gather together to oppress Israel. And now, instead of it being multiple nations that are gathering together in this way, now it's one giant beast, one conglomeration of a beast. And almost every scholar says John would have thought, as he's talking about this, that he's talking about Rome. This conglomeration of nations that are patched together from each one that are now oppressing the church, that his hearers would have also heard this beast being Rome specifically, or at least the Caesar of Rome, the leader, the emperor of Rome. And especially with verse 3, and I found this really interesting, that you have this language which is kind of confusing. I'm going to end my screen share here so we can all see each other again. But this language about one of the heads had a fatal wound on it, and then that wound seemed to be healed and made all the people marvel and worship. I didn't know this previously, but I found it really interesting in studying that Nero, who was a particularly egregious persecutor of the church, when he died, there were lots of rumors about Nero not actually being dead, still being alive, coming back like we don't have anything in modern history that kind of works with this, save maybe Napoleon, where Napoleon is exiled. And then there's all these rumors. Is Napoleon coming back? Oh, he's coming back this time. What's going on? There were rumors about, did Nero really die? Had Nero come back to life? Pretenders to the throne who came back and said, I am Nero, resurrected from the dead to come back and reclaim the Roman Empire. And people followed these Neros. So to have this language about one who has a fatal wound, who now seems to be recovered, is almost certainly a reference to this cult of Nero that existed at the time. And this isn't to say that John is saying in a roundabout way, the Antichrist is going to be Nero, and Nero is going to come back from the dead and be the servant of the devil. But just like we talk about John the Baptist being a type of Elijah, and we can say he was like Elijah in the desert preparing the way for the Lord, even though we're saying he's not reincarnated Elijah, but he's fulfilling that type that was given to us. In the same way, John is using the type of Nero to say, this is like what this leader is going to be. It's going to be like Rome. It's going to be like the Caesar. There's going to be this cult of influence and power and intrigue that's surrounding in this way. And so the image portrayed by John is a ruler or a leader who's given authority by Satan and worshiped by those who are on the earth. We have all this language about the authority that is given, the power that is given to this beast, to this leader, to this Antichrist. And so the church is going to be, by this text, persecuted and wounded, but faithfulness and endurance are called for. We have this kind of call to almost a nonviolent acceptance of this persecution. Those who are going to go into captivity they go. Those who should be killed or are going to be killed, they're going to be killed. There's not this promise of supernatural deliverance in every one of these moments. And I think John knows that that's kind of a difficult message to give the church, because he says right after, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of God's people in verse 10. So I wanted to say, with all of that, because there's so much going on there, what do we take from this description, and what do we hold on to as God's message for us in the midst of all of this? Have you read or interpreted these verses before? Are these verses something that you tend to stay away from, like the third rail, because you're going to get zapped pretty good when you try? I mean, what's your history with these verses, with Revelation 13 at the beginning here?
I'm struggling because you're calling the beast the Antichrist. You're using those two terms interchangeably, if I'm understanding you correctly.
What's causing the confusion or the thought there?
You're calling the beast the Antichrist.
I think in a lot of the research and the stuff that I found, that they're offered as a very similar role, or at least working almost in parallel with each other, in comparison with what we'll see through 11 through 18 of the second beast that comes out of the earth, which is a separate character or idea. But have you read or interpreted that in a different way, Sandy? Because it seems like that's a sticking point.
Verse 4 just doesn't go together with what you're saying.
How so?
So is the dragon and the beast the same thing?
I don't think that they're the same thing. I think the dragon, if we look back to Revelation 12, is referred to as the accuser or the devil, the one who woe to the earth, for he has been cast down to the sea and to the land, for the devil has gone down to you, in Revelation 12. So I think the dragon specifically is supposed to be Satan, or is supposed to be this symbolic representation of the devil. And then the beast that arises seems to be one in whom the devil sets his authority or his power and tries to empower in this way who points back to the dragon, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Does that clarify it or further confuse it? You can be honest with me.
Well, whatever it is, they're both being worshiped. So neither one of them deserve worship. So the bottom line is that they're the bad guys.
Yes. And I think it's good to talk about some of this stuff, because especially when we talk about and use some of this language, when we talk about the Antichrist or some of this stuff going on, what we probably all do is we load those words with our past interpretations, with past things that we've heard, with what we've read, and then we bring that to the text. And that's not saying you're doing that, Sandy. It's saying every one of us is doing that when we read about the Antichrist, the beast, the dragon, the 10 horns, the 7 heads, whatever it might be, that each one of us is bringing a lot of that stuff. And so sometimes we can be using the same verbiage, but speaking about different things or different ideas because of that. So that's why I'm trying to suss out where's the holdup, where's the question, because I think that's really helpful, because otherwise somebody will say one thing and then we'll look at them and say, what do they mean by that? Isn't it this? And that's because we're using the same words to represent different truths here. So I think there's still a lot here. Did anybody else have a question, a thought, or something that you wanted to share from these first few verses as we read them together? Not right now. There is a lot going on in these, and we're getting the next scene in this very symbolic spiritual retelling of this history of God's people, just like we saw in the previous chapter about the woman and her child and the dragon and this fight that exists among them. It's not strictly happening after all the events of Revelation 1 through 11. It's this cosmic spiritual story that's being told. So there's some overlap, there's some difference, and there's a lot of intentionally vague symbolism, because I don't think John is trying to give us a one-to-one breakdown, like a play-by-play of what's going to happen, so much as he's trying to paint this picture of despair and redemption as we get through. But I think there are some things that we can take even from these first few verses. One, that God remains in control even as things are completely going off the rails in Revelation 13. The beast's time and his authority, even though he has authority over all the people, the nations, the tribes, and the languages, his time is limited. Mankind is not lost to God. It's not that all of humanity has slipped out of God's grasp, but almost like Romans 1, where God gives over man to his sinful desires in his heart. There's a similar idea here of God is at this point where the people have quit worshiping God, despite the calls and the signs that without chance say, this is what's going on. And he kind of gives them over to this power for those that have not turned yet. He says, okay, there's nothing else I can do here. But there is the power and the control of God, that this is a limited time. And I think there's also something to us that when we trust in the control of God in the midst of this circumstance, it measures the kind of control we take in our response to it. Because we're called to stand up to this evil, but not to do so by military power or might and strength. That it says that all the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, whose names have not been written in the book of life. So we're not overcome spiritually. We're not led, even in that last moment, to worship this beast. But we know that our bodies might be subject to what's going on, or the church might be subject to the pain that occurs here. And Keener said in this idea of the faithful endurance, or the patient endurance and faithfulness that's called on for the church, he said, history shows that every kingdom based upon power has collapsed, yet God's people have persevered and now leaven the nations. And I loved that sentence that every empire that tries to base itself on power ultimately crumbles in this world. Like, it just happens as a point of history. But the church, which historically has tried to step away from that role of power and instead say, we trust that victory is secured in submission to God and in obedience, but not necessarily violence. The church is the one that endures throughout all of that, even as every other kingdom falls. And so I think there really is an intentional hope to that. So I want us to jump into these next few verses and then be able to have some discussion on the basis of the whole text here. I know we kind of raced through those first 10 verses, but it's in part because I have more questions that I want us to talk about that kind of relate to both of these as one. So in verse 11, we get the continuation of this vision from John. And he says, then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose fatal wound had been healed. And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs, it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast. It deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the image to be killed. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. So those are some verses that have been absolutely interpreted, reinterpreted, and done a million things with to try to figure out what is John talking about here. But I want us to look at these beasts first. If the first beast has this political authority, has authority over the nations and the people, what kind of authority does this second beast have, according to John's vision? What's going on here? Does this beast sound like a political leader, like an emperor or a king, or does he sound like another role or another kind of leader? Which verse is that? This is verses 11 through 18. I think, for me at least, as I read it, especially verses 13 and I guess 12 and 13. I saw more of a religious leader here, that he's causing the earth to worship the first beast. Kind of feels like a priest or a prophet almost, especially it brings up to me the imagery of like Elijah the prophet, who's calling fire down from the heavens to the earth in order to convince people to worship. And he has this ability to kill all those who refuse to worship, and all of these things that are going on, including infusing this image of the beast with spirit, with breath to be able to speak. There's signs and deceit and wonder in this that almost reminds me of Pharaoh and his advisors, who were able to mimic and mock the signs that Moses brings to Pharaoh, when it's turning the river to blood or turning his staff into a snake, all of these things. And then his advisors say, well, we can do that too. Look at this. You don't have to take God seriously. But there's a couple of these things going on here. And I think we see the government being operated by that first beast and some sort of a religious institution being set up by the second one. This process of divination, signs and wonders, and leading others to worship. But these are definitely, it's like looking at a broken mirror. It's a reflection, but it's skewed, shattered a little bit here. It's, mimicked, but not in a one-for-one perfection as they go through. Where are the disjointed natures between the beast's governmental authority and God's authority that we talk about in the kingdom? Or if we talk about the second beast, the prophetic nature of this second beast of leading others to worship versus our role as the church. How are government and religion kind of mocked and parodied by these two without getting it exactly right? What do y'all think?
I think you need to repeat that question.
I'm sorry.
I follow all of that.
How are they?
I think that there's this relationship between the two beasts where the first beast has received his authority from the dragon, right? We saw that in those first verses, and then gives up that authority to the first beast. And now the second beast exercises authority on behalf of the first beast. So we have this kind of playing down of authority, this hierarchy that's been established. And it seems to me, and y'all can feel free to tell me that you read it a different way, that this first beast taking some governmental authority or political power and authority over all the nations. And the second beast seems to be mimicking the church almost, or those disciples and the prophets, being able to perform signs and wonders that lead everybody to worshiping the first beast. And so I wanted to ask where the error is in this mirror image of the government and the church that I think these two beasts are trying to mimic. But where does the reflection incorrect, or what doesn't ring true between them?
We have choices. We can make choices. The church, all of us can make choices. And then there's also forgiveness. And there's none of that. There isn't going to be any of that between these two dudes.
Yeah. These two beasts don't seem to be that much into free will and making a choice.
No.
The second beast specifically, you set up the image, and all those who don't worship, he has the authority to just kill those, whoever they might be. What's that? No, say what you're saying.
We've already seen this in history, so I can see how it'd be easy for people to already think it's happened, or if they're going through it, to be like, oh my gosh, it's the end times, because I don't know, like Hitler or something. I could see that.
I think Mandy brought up, if y'all could hear that, the historical backgrounds of, she said, we've almost seen this kind of play out at different times throughout human history. She brought up Hitler, of this same kind of thing. So it's the understanding of somebody who might be living through something like that and then reads this and says, we're in the end times. Like, we're seeing this be fulfilled within our presence right now. And I think it's an important thing to think about, because Hitler, for our culture, Hitler is always the easy thing that we can kind of go to and say, if we want to think of the personification of evil, the Nazis really do kind of check that box. Their symbols were literally like a skull and crossbones on their the insignias on their stuff.
The political aspect is what like stands out, because it's like,
Here, speak a little louder so people
sorry.
at home can hear you.
The political aspect, like getting people on his side, and you're like, how on earth could you partner up with such, but
yeah,
I don't know. I don't know how to put my thoughts together. I'm just, that's what sticks out.
No, for sure. There is this political power and strength, and also the cult of worship that kind of goes with that propaganda almost. And it made me think of, there's a quote from, I think it's Martin Niemöller, who was a German pastor in the late 30s as the Nazi party was coming to power. And there were a lot of churches who did not speak out against Hitler and the Nazis as they were rising up, either because they were afraid of retribution or because they bought into the same kind of grievance politic that Hitler proclaimed. And so they said, yeah, it is time for the fatherland to rise up, and it is time for this and that. And if Hitler will do it, then great. Martin Niemöller was not one of those. He preached against this kind of power and against that kind of cult of personality that was calling for worship. And of course, as you would imagine with the Nazis, he ended up in jail for this. He was considered a subversive and an anarchist and this and that. And so he was arrested, and a pastor friend of his went to him and said, "What are you doing in jail?" And Martin Niemöller's response to him was to look at his friend who was also a pastor, and he said, "Brother, what are you doing not in jail right now? Like, how are you not speaking out against this?" And Keener in his text kind of brings up this idea: the devil doesn't know when Christ is returning. That time is not given to the devil to make a plan. So there's almost always these irons in the fire of, how are you going to compete against Jesus when he returns? And so we can kind of see throughout history some of these supremely evil situations going on. And that was from what Keener was saying, and I think there's some truth to it, of the devil trying to be prepared while he has authority to wield on trying to make this happen. And we can see those kind of attempts throughout human history. But we know that because God is in control, that stuff doesn't succeed ever, but it doesn't even get legs under it until God's ready to allow that to happen, for his purposes through the end to be fulfilled. There's a lot that has changed when we start thinking about, this is how John sees Rome. And this is a pretty stark view of Rome, and a pretty scary view of Rome, that he's using this language and talking about Rome. I mean, the 10 horns and all this are kind of Roman imagery of the 10 hills. We've gone a long way from Paul in Romans. In Romans 13, when he says, "Submit yourself to the governing authorities, for they do not wield the sword in vain," there is a lot that has changed here between that call to submission to the government and this call that says, you know what, they're evil, but where is our role to endure this as we go through? And I wanted to ask y'all, because I think it speaks to our culture and the questions that get asked now about Christianity. Where do we draw the line when it comes to submission to a government? Where do we draw that line between Romans 13, submit yourselves to governing authorities, and then all the way to Revelation 13, where we see the ruling authorities being described as the beasts and the power and the evil? Like, how do we draw the line between those two? How do we discern?
I think we already have a faction right here in Cordova who've drawn a line.
Yeah.
And that they are looking at the vaccination as being something that is at least not healthy, and at best evil, and that it's putting them in a place of putting all of us in a place of where either some of us are following and become like sheep, or not taking the mark of the beast. I mean, if you want to take this one step further, he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark. Well, it's not on our hand or on our foreheads, but we have a little card that we carry in our hand that allows us a little bit more freedom than those people who've not been vaccinated. And it's to the point where you won't even be able to do any business, without it.
You said it exactly, that we are witnessing the different interpretive frameworks within our own community when it comes to, do we view what's going on in our world right now? And I hear this debate happening exactly like you said. Some people who interpret the events of today through the lens of Revelation 13, and those who interpret it through the lens of Romans 13 and say, you know what? I should submit to the governing authorities. If they ask me to do this, I should do this. And we have that different hermeneutical framework going on that leads to, like I was saying, where we can use the same language and be talking about two different things. That when we talk about, I need to be faithful to what God's called me to do, two Christians can say that and agree wholeheartedly and then veer off in totally different directions about what that means in today's age. And so,
something even before that, Sandy, I agree with you totally. But even before that, with the masking and the not masking, we even saw that here in the churches, where our church chose to mask to follow the leadership of the town, the government, the local government, and other chose not to mask, saying, where's your faith in God? And it became a thing across the country to say, well, where's your mask? Well, where's your faith? And it's like, excuse me, that line was drawn too. And the same is saying with the vaccination, to where people who are not vaccinated are not allowed to do things that people who are vaccinated are, and it will be carried out even farther.
Let me ask I think we're doing a good job of describing that the different frameworks that exist right now, and we can see those at play in our communities. And I mean, right here in Cordova and across the country and the world even. But how do we as Christians discern, not just in the specific right now, but in the general, where is that line when we talk about submitting to the government and following, or where do we find that space to obey or to endure, if we want to use the language of Romans versus Revelation? Darla, you have something?
I over and over in my brain say, given to God, what Jesus said was, given to Rome that which is Rome, or into Caesar, which is Caesar, and unto God what is God. And we know that our children can't go into school without certain vaccinations, and it's been there to protect their health and the health of the children, other children in the school. And I don't see how this vaccination is any different. This scientifically has been worked on for a lot longer than what they first admitted. And they have hope that this can actually lead to some ways of curing cancer. My son is working in the middle of this for fast tests, doing the research with other people and scientists in Germany. So for me, it's very strong. The government has a right to keep our people safe. And when you have 800,000 people dying now in our country, then yes, the government has a responsibility to help protect each other, just like we protect our children in school.
Okay. I totally agree with what Darla is saying. Although students can go to school without any vaccinations because of religious differences. And I know in Colorado, yes, because then you had a group of people who came up and said, okay, these students do not have to be vaccinated because it goes against their religious beliefs. Therefore, as a parent, I can exercise the same right that my student can go to school without the vaccinations, and they were allowed to.
And then we had a reoccurrence of several different diseases that have not come forth for 30, 40 years.
This is good, but what I'm noticing is that we're talking a lot more about vaccines than we're talking about the line of where do we obey government. So that's what I want to.
For me, give to God what is God. And Jesus told us what is God. To love him first of all, and to love each other, and to do loving things. And that is a concern for other people in all different kind of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, I just wanted to say, I think too that we're to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's, and all of that is real and very true. I mean, we're told that. I think where the discrepancy comes in is when the government tells you, that you have to denounce your faith in God or die. And that does happen in some countries.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you have to denounce your faith in God, are you going to follow the government at that point? Mm-hmm. I think that's where the stickler comes in, and we don't face that here, thank God. But there are people who do face that. And I think we do obey it up until a point, but not to the point where we denounce God and our faith in.
What were you going to say, Sandy?
I just said we will. Our time is coming. It will be that way everywhere.
Yeah.
I believe, yes.
And I mean, I think that's part of what this chapter is kind of calling us to, is that the vigilance of that and the being aware. And I really appreciate how you said that, because it kind of gets right into my next question, where I was going to say of this, that line of submission really gets drawn on whether we view the government or the religion that we're talking about as being a true one or a false one. And that's what really stuck out to me in this chapter, is that especially with the second beast, signs and wonders are being performed, which really, I think, can kind of shock us when we think scripturally, where we want to say, well, I mean, we have the power of Christ. We can perform signs and wonders. Other people can't. There's no power there. But here we have signs, wonders, fire from heaven. If somebody went outside right now and called down fire from heaven, I'm going to listen to what that person has to say, because that's something I haven't seen before. Yeah. And so we have that question where the church is called not just to endurance of what goes on, but to faithfulness, to not give up the truth that we proclaim and the faith that we profess. But we also are called to this discernment of how do we differentiate between the true signs of God and the false. It reminds me of Jesus when he says, many people will come to me at the end and say, haven't I prophesied in your name and healed these people and done this? And I'll say, depart from me, I never knew you. That used to always shake me to my core, because I think, I have not performed any signs like that. And if those aren't good enough to get into heaven, oh man, am I in trouble? But it's not about the signs, false or true. It's about the relationship that we have. And if we want to talk about how do we discern false signs and wonders from true signs and wonders, I think you nailed it absolutely on the head. It's not about the things that are being done, but about the message that's being proclaimed and the fruit that's being lived out in the midst of it. So just like Sandy was talking about, of these false governments or religion that have no concern for free will or life or liberty, then we can say, well, that kind of flies in the face of a lot of what we know about the gospel. If we're being called to worship with a spear to our back saying, I'll kill you if you don't on this, then maybe that's a sign for us that says, regardless of the signs that were performed that made this look powerful, I don't think this is a power I want to be with, if this is how we have to compel worship or obedience. And I think that's part of that discernment, is recognizing the difference between power and fruit. Because the fruit of the Spirit is not known. It's not a coconut, for one. Thank you, Mandy, in your preschool songs.
You're welcome.
But the fruit of the Spirit is not known in power and in might. But what are the fruits of the Spirit?
Love, joy,
love, joy,
Gentleness and self-control.
Gentleness, self-control, peace, patience, love. These are not things that are follow me or die right now. These are not things that say, look at how strong and mighty I am and give me the power I deserve or be crushed under my boot. And I think that's part of how we discern false and true is by humility, love, and the self-control and gentleness that's exhibited by those who perform those signs. And for me, I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I can take from this chapter, is to know the tree by its fruit and not just by how tall or how big it is, but to really discern and say, what kind of life is being lived here? What kind of message is truly being proclaimed? And then to discern in that way above and beyond any external signs of quote unquote success, if that makes sense.
Mike, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I mean, I know that most people feel like we're living in the end times, and I agree with that. However, I think that at different times in history, people in the church felt like they were living in the end times before. They weren't. When they were under Roman occupation, I'm sure they felt like times. I'm sure the Jews felt like it was the end times during Hitler's reign. I think there's a lot that we've felt it's been the end time and it hasn't been. So, it's just, do we see enough signs that we do interpret this as being the end times now?
I think you are absolutely right that we are not the first generation. In fact, I'd go as far as to say every generation of Christians has thought that they were living in the end times at some point. And I'll go even further to say they weren't wrong, because Christ tells us the time is not known to you, therefore don't be asleep. I think we are supposed to be ready and living as if we are living in the end times. And I think that means it calls for endurance and in faithfulness and in gentleness and being sure of our faith and having that urgency that we live and we share the gospel with others, because we say, he could come back like a thief in the night. That's what Christ says, right? So we have to be ready and say, today could be the last day. I don't know. Do I want to get caught sleeping today, or do I want to be about the kingdom work that God set before me? And so I think you're absolutely right. When they were under Roman rule and persecution, it was the end times. And then when they became co-opted by the Roman Empire and the Roman Empire dissolved and was overrun, I can guarantee you they thought it was the end times. It changes every time, but that's because the church should be waiting and saying, this could be it. But instead of trying to either run ourselves into a panic or convince ourselves that we don't need to panic, maybe what God's calling us to is, if this were the end times, how would you be living? And then there's that kind of follow-up question that says, now go do that. If this were the end times and you say, you know what I would do? I'd be telling everybody I know about Jesus, because I know that moment's coming where they might not be able to make that decision anymore. Or I know that these bad things might happen. And then I feel like God's saying, yeah, and you don't know the hour, so go get busy. Go do that stuff. And in the meantime, make sure that you're discerning those signs as you go. I think that's what Jesus says in Matthew, to just be aware of the signs of this world, but don't think that you can figure out the day and the hour. Because even Jesus said, I don't have that information right now, when he was on earth with his disciples. So I think it might be a little gutsy for us to say that we're going to have the day and the hour, and we can sort it out just by what's going on in the newspaper. Before we close out, I wanted us to talk a little bit about the mark of the beast, because A, it's some evocative stuff. B, it's going on in the world. And C, we have this highly enigmatic number, the 666, and what do we do with it? So I wanted to give a little bit of background here because I think it's useful. And one is, this was likely a riddle that was written by John, and it would have been understood at least in some way by his audience, because he says, this calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number. And so people have tried to come up with every single way, just like we talked about before, to figure out, well, who is the Antichrist? Who meets this number requirement? Because it's the number of a man. And you can do anything you want with numbers to make any person fit this pattern. Like, guaranteed, you can do it. When you get into all the numerical stuff that can go on in the Hebrew language or the Greek or the English language, people said Ronald Reagan was the Antichrist because his first, middle, and last name each had 6 letters. That you can pull, and I saw somebody in the commentary that I was reading who had proved that Barney was the Antichrist, because if you did the numerology, if you said cute purple dinosaur and counted up the numbers, it came out to 666. Like, you can play the number games with it a lot. And I think instead of trying to figure out, well, who is it in today's day, we're trying to solve a riddle with only, you know, this much of the information, when the contextual time they would have had this much. And so we're kind of left. A lot of people have thought that it references specifically Nero, that if you count up the letters in Nero's name by doing that numerology that existed, you can get to Nero Caesar, and it literally counts up to that. But I think there's even more to this. Of we have seen the symbolism of numbers throughout Revelation so much, and 7 has come up lots and lots and lots of times, right? And part of that is because it's the number of perfection. It is the perfect number, the number of completeness. And that's kind of what it represents throughout Revelation. And so now we have this 666, which represents this less than perfection, this attempt to be it, but constantly coming short of it. And so I think that there is some symbolism within that number as well, but I think we do well by trying to avoid pinning it on a person, a company, or a technology in our day, whether it's a microchip or a vaccine or a tattoo that's in a barcode, because people thought 2,000 years ago that they knew what the mark of the beast was going to be. And it was a brand that was literally going to be put on people as a inversion of the prayer scrolls that Jewish people would wear on their hands and on their foreheads, called the tefillin. And this was like a subversion of that. I don't think that the mark has to be visible, but I think it's probably spiritually apparent and predictive for our place in the book of life, because this mark of the beast is kind of contrasted with the mark of the Lamb that was placed on everybody in Revelation 7, on all the followers. So instead of trying to figure out, well, what could it be? What could it mean in our own time? I think if we are living the life that God's called us to live, we are avoiding that symbol or that sign, whatever and wherever it might be. If we're vigilant against false teaching and false prophets, if we're constantly trying to live out the fruits of the Spirit, I don't think we can get accidentally marked with this mark, I guess is my point. I don't think we're just going to be asleep at the wheel one day and say, oh man, I had no idea that debit cards were the mark of the beast, which is another one that was offered up at a time. And so instead of trying to throw darts at the board and try to guess what the mark of the beast is, I think we're probably better off saying, what is the life that God is calling me to live to avoid these kind of things, whatever they may be, and then to live that life. And if it's a life of the fruit of the Spirit and of vigilance and of dedication to God, then I think we can rest kind of easy that we're not going to be lulled into something by our lack of attention, if that makes sense. So that was a lot. This was a heavy Bible study and a lot of stuff going on here. Does anybody have any other things that you wanted to say, questions you wanted to ask? Because there's a ton going on here. And like we were talking about, it touches on so much stuff and conversations that even go on in our world right now that I think it's valuable to take some time to unpack some of this. How's everybody feeling? Anything that you wanted to add or clarify or question? Susan and Rhonda, we didn't hear much from you guys. Is there anything that's that you wanted to throw out? That God's
this might be a crazy question, and it might have been one of the nights that I missed the study, but where does the actual term Antichrist come from?
I believe it comes from John's letters, like 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. I need to find, I don't know the exact verse off the top of my head, but I believe it is a term that comes from that. It would help if I could spell on my computer. Here we go. Yeah, 1 John 4, 1 through 6. That's what's getting pulled up here as I just Googled that to try to find the exact thing. And I'm going to try to pull that up here real quick.
Oh, there it is.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty interesting in 1 John, because if I remember, it is not talking about one specific person. Yeah, here we go. Every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming, and even now is already in the world. And so this encouragement is less about one boogeyman, if we want to think of that, and it's more about a spirit that denies the truth and revelation of God. And I think that is the same way that we can read it throughout Revelation, is that this isn't necessarily some slick back, charismatic, like person who's convincing everybody by their own resourcefulness to worship the devil, as much as it is a pervasive spirit of rejecting God's word, God's truth, and God's salvation, that is the Antichrist within the world. And so that's where the language comes from in 1 John. And I think it might pop up somewhere else too, but to be honest with you, I don't have that scripture in front of me. I'll try to find it and maybe include it in a little add-on when I send out the stuff with the description of the Bible study, or the link for the video here. And I'll try to do a little bit of that legwork before I send that out. But I think that's a good question, because again, we pull these words, and knowing where they come from or what they mean is, I think, an important thing here. Good question, Rhonda.
Well, thank you. I like what 1 John 4:4 says.
Yes.
It says, you, dear children, are from God and have overcome them, because the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. So he's saying, okay, well, this is what we're looking at, but you got God, so you're fine. You just need to be aware that this is something that you might have to deal with, but that you have the power, because God gives you the power to overcome them. Yeah.
That is a really good extra word that ties in so well with what we're talking about in Revelation. Because like we talked about a couple weeks ago, it can be so easy to convince yourself that this is a cosmic battle between good and evil, that somehow these are equal parties in this fight, and we're caught in this tug of war. And it's a great reminder where John is saying, no. Does the devil have schemes and tricks and powers and whatever? Sure. But they are a drop in the bucket of the ocean compared to the power of God. Like, there is no power there that succeeds against God and God's children. John talks about, or Jesus talks about in the Gospel of John, those that are in my hand cannot be plucked from my hand. And there is a lot of hope, and I think the strength to persevere and endure in that truth, that we don't have to be worried that we're going to be swiped when we're not paying attention. God says, you are mine, and that is the end of the story, which is why we want to find ourselves in him in that moment, because that's where the safety and security fall over and against everything else. But that is good. I appreciate it. I am actually kind of impressed that we were able to get through all of Revelation 13 in an hour together here. And so I want us to close out our time because we're getting right near the end of it here. But I appreciate everybody tackling a really difficult chapter and a really complicated one. And I think a really charged chapter with a lot of stuff here. Because like we were talking about, we hear this being evoked in our own world right now and in our communities. And I think it's really helpful to study it together and to know what we're talking about when we enter into those conversations. So I appreciate our willingness to jump into it here together. I hope it's a blessing for you guys and the start of conversations and not the end of one, because I think that's really what God's calling us to do here. But let me say a prayer for us and we'll close out, and then I'll look that stuff up. Yeah, Rhonda.
Could you just mention, reminding us now of what will be happening next Tuesday?
That's a good call. Next Tuesday, instead of our Bible study happening like this, we'll meet at the church building. And I think Shannon is going to lead us in a Christmas carol sing-along. And so we'll have the opportunity to sing together, worship together, and just have a really good time to do that. So everybody's, what's that?
In person.
In person, yeah. We'll have it going on YouTube as well for those that can't be here. But if it's a sing along, as many people as can be here, because I think it's really gonna be a nice time to just sing carols together and do that.
My
so
mom was asking, so
okay.
We're gonna stream it.
Yeah, we'll definitely stream it like we normally do our stuff.
Okay.
So that'll be really good. Let me say a prayer for us. Thank you for that reminder, Rhonda. That was a good call. Let's pray. Father, we thank you that there is nothing that goes on in this world that is outside your power, your authority, and your awareness. We thank you that even in the midst of evil in our world, that even as things are going on around us, we know that you are our refuge and our strength. You are our stronghold, and you will not be overtaken. So help us to be aware of what's going on in this world, and not just to be afraid of powers that rear their heads, but to be patient and to endure and to trust in the fruits of your spirit to overcome each and every spirit of this age. Father, we love you. We rely on you. Help us to find our footing in you and in you alone, because we know that we will not be shaken when we are with you. We love you and we praise you, Father. In the power of your Holy Spirit, we pray tonight. Amen.
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 All right. God bless you all and have a wonderful night.
Bless.
You too.